No adversary is more enduring than frailty. It does not rush the clash or announce itself in the strike. It waits in the narrow space before commitment, in the quiet pause where intention softens and resolve loosens its grip. It lives in the breath that comes too late, the hand that hesitates a fraction longer than it should. That is where warriors fall. The way of the samurai was never a search for calm or comfort. It was a hunt for refinement. Steel is not strengthened by avoiding fire, and a spirit without order collapses beneath the weight of its own chaos. One swordsman understood this before most could name it. Born into an era where conflict never slept, he did not wait for power to arrive like a visitor. He shaped it alone in long hours of silence, carving discipline from repetition, ink, and sweat. Each day was a strike. Each strike was a lesson, until the boundary between man and blade dissolved. Near the end of his life, when ambition had burned away and only truth remained, he wrote a final teaching. He urged the reader to hold the self lightly and the world with gravity, because the ego is static. It begs for ease, admiration, escape. The world answers none of it. Rivers do not slow for regret. Mountains do not bow to anxiety. You either rise to their level or disappear beneath their weight. This is not a legend of triumph. It is an accounting, the story of a young samurai who had everything handed to him and still stood on unstable ground, and the wandering master who revealed the 10 disciplines they tried to bury with time. Disciplines not born from philosophy, but from consequence. These are not routines. They are instruments. They strip confusion. They cauterize softness. They leave behind only what can endure. Chapter 1. The Warrior Who Seemed Complete. Osaka Province. Spring, 1612. Takeshi of the Hayashi clan stepped into the circle with the confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. 22 summers old, raised among banners and blades, trained since childhood, 15 years of relentless instruction, 3 schools of swordsmanship mastered. His posture was exact, his movements precise. He was the pride of his teacher and the symbol of his family's future. 300 eyes watched as he bowed. Everything in his life had pointed to this moment. Across from him stood his opponent, a drifter, no lineage, no recognized school, no stories spoken in advance. His robe was worn thin, his wooden sword chipped and scarred. He looked like a man who had lost more than he carried. There was nothing impressive about him. The duel should have ended quickly. The signal was given. Takeshi raised his blade into perfect alignment, just as he had practiced thousands of times. His opponent did not move. He stood still, weapon lowered, gaze unfocused. Takeshi waited. No attack, no feint, nothing. A question crept into his mind. Why is he not moving? Another followed. Is this deception? His teacher's voice echoed in memory. Never strike first unless the opponent commits. The moment stretched, thought multiplied, certainty thinned, then it was over. Before Takeshi understood what had happened, his sword was no longer in his hands. One clean motion, one opening exploited, 3 breaths from beginning to end, defeat, silence swallowed the crowd, then murmurs, the air of Hayashi brought down by a nameless wanderer. Takeshi stood motionless, not from the loss, but from the realization that when it mattered most, his training had evaporated. His body froze, his mind stalled. Everything he relied on failed him. He had hesitated. That night, he did not return home. He could not face the quiet disappointment in his father's eyes or the unspoken judgment of the clan. He left Osaka with no destination, walking until the road lost its name. Days later, deep in the mountains, he came upon a small shrine, and there, seated calmly as if expected, was the man who had defeated him. Takeshi's hand moved instinctively toward his sword. "Sit," the wanderer said, his voice even. "If you still believe another fight will answer your questions, then you learned nothing." "You shamed me," Takeshi said. "No," the man replied. "I showed you what was already there." Anger surged, but beneath it stirred something unfamiliar. interest. "My technique is flawless," Takeshi said. "I trained my entire life." "Yes," the Ronin replied. "You trained to perform, not to endure." The words struck deeper than steel. "Your movements are beautiful, your form exact. But under pressure, beauty breaks. You hesitated. That hesitation cost you everything." "Who are you?" Takeshi asked. "A traveler," the man said, "once a student of a master who understood the difference between appearance and substance. If you are willing to dismantle what you think you know, I will teach you what survives when form collapses." Takeshi lowered himself to his knees. "I will learn." "We begin at dawn," the Ronin said, "and we begin with the discipline most men fail before they ever lift a blade." Chapter 2. The first discipline: rise without debate. Before dawn, the Ronin's voice cut through the cold air. "Stand." Takeshi's body protested. The previous day's climb had drained him, muscles ached. Fatigue whispered excuses. "Stand." There was no space for argument. He rose. "Each morning at your dojo," the Ronin asked, "how did you wake?" "My attendant called me," Takeshi replied. "And you weighed the day, considered your energy, negotiated." Takeshi said nothing. "This is the first discipline. Begin without discussion. The sun does not consult the sky before rising. A blade does not hesitate before cutting. Why do you treat your path as optional?" He demonstrated, rising in a single smooth motion. No pause, no preparation, just action. "Again," he said. It took dozens of attempts before Takeshi could stand without internal resistance. "Tomorrow," the Ronin said, "you wake yourself. No signal, no reminder. When the moment arrives, you move. Discipline is born in the first act of the day." Chapter 3. The second discipline: act without emotion. On the seventh day, the Ronin handed Takeshi a wooden sword. "Hold your stance," he said. "Defend against my voice." Then the words came. Insults, accusations, shame spoken aloud. Takeshi's body reacted before thought. Rage tightened his grip. His stance shifted forward. The Ronin stepped back. "See, emotion commands you." "They were only words," Takeshi protested, "and yet you obeyed them." "In battle," the Ronin continued, "anger clouds judgment, fear dulls precision. A warrior who moves from feeling is already controlled." He spoke of storms that pass and clouds that deceive, of clarity that remains only when emotion is observed, not followed. For days, the tests continued, provocation after provocation, strike after strike. Slowly, Takeshi learned to feel without reacting, to act without being pulled. By the 10th day, something inside him had changed, not strength, stillness, and the understanding that what they tried to erase from history was never technique, but discipline itself. If this resonates, leave a comment and continue the path. The remaining disciplines are waiting. The second discipline did not end when the insults stopped. That was the mistake Takeshi almost made. He believed endurance meant surviving provocation in the moment. Kensei corrected him before the misunderstanding hardened. "Emotion does not only arrive as anger," the Ronin said. "It comes as hope, as impatience, as the hunger to be finished." On the morning after the final provocation, Takeshi woke before the cold light reached the shrine steps. His body rose without argument now, but his mind rushed ahead. How many disciplines remain? How long until I am strong again? How long until I am no longer ashamed? Kensei struck the ground with a stick. "You are already leaving," he said. "Leaving where?" Takeshi asked silently. "Leaving now." That morning, the Ronin did not hand him a weapon. Instead, he pointed toward the mountain path. "Walk," he said, "and do not improve it." They walked for hours in silence. When Takeshi tried to quicken his pace, Kensei slowed. When he slowed, Kensei stopped. The rhythm never belonged to Takeshi. Finally, frustration surfaced. "What is this discipline?" Takeshi asked. "The third," Kensei replied. "Endure boredom." Takeshi frowned. "In battle," Kensei continued, "men imagine danger is the greatest test. It is not. Waiting is. Stillness, repetition, the hours where nothing happens and the mind begins inventing reasons to escape." They sat by a stream until shadows shifted twice. Takeshi's legs stiffened. His thoughts multiplied. Memories of his defeat returned uninvited. "Do not push them away," Kensei said. "Let them speak. Just do not answer." This was harder than rage. Rage burned fast. Boredom dissolved slowly, like acid. Takeshi realized most of his training had been designed to entertain him. New forms, new goals, new praise. Nothing had trained him to remain when nothing rewarded him. "You lost in Osaka," Kensei said quietly, "long before you hesitated. You lost because your mind required stimulation. When none came, it panicked." That night, Takeshi slept poorly. The silence felt louder than insults. For 7 days, the pattern continued. Long walks, long sits, repeated tasks with no variation. Fetch water, stack wood, unstack it, stack it again. On the 8th day, something shifted. Not relief, not clarity, space. The need to escape weakened. Kensei nodded once. "Most men fail here," he said. "They call it wasted time and return to noise. This discipline is called remaining." The 4th discipline arrived without announcement. At dawn, Kensei placed Takeshi at the edge of a narrow ravine. Wind moved through it unpredictably. "Cross," he said. The path was uneven. One misstep would mean injury, perhaps worse. Takeshi measured the distance carefully. "Do not calculate," Kensei said. "Feel." Takeshi hesitated. "You are still trying to be correct," Kensei continued. "Correctness is slower than truth." Takeshi took a step, then another. Fear rose, sharp and physical. His body leaned back instinctively. "Stop," Kensei said. "Now return." Takeshi obeyed. "You leaned away from danger," Kensei said. "That is natural, but warriors who retreat inside themselves lose balance outside." The discipline, Kensei explained, was called forward pressure, not aggression, commitment. "In combat," he said, "the man who half decides has already decided to lose. Even retreat must be total, even advance must be complete." They repeated the crossing dozens of times. Each failure came from the same place, not lack of skill, but divided intention. On the final attempt, Takeshi stepped without internal commentary. No plan, no story, just movement. His feet found their place. When he reached the other side, his hands shook. "Good," Kensei said. "Fear obeyed you this time." Days later, the 5th discipline emerged through hunger. Kensei reduced Takeshi's meals without warning, first slightly, then drastically. "Why?" Takeshi asked on the 3rd day, his stomach tight. "Because comfort teaches nothing," Kensei replied. Takeshi's thoughts grew loud. Food occupied his imagination. He noticed how easily irritation surfaced. "In your old life," Kensei said, "hunger meant inconvenience. In war, it means exposure. A man who cannot function while deprived becomes dangerous to himself." This discipline was not starvation. It was restraint. Takeshi learned to move precisely while weakened, to listen carefully when energy dropped, to recognize that much of his former strength had been borrowed from abundance. By the end of the week, food returned slowly. Takeshi ate with attention he had never known. "Good," Kensei said. "You are learning respect for enough." The 6th discipline came wrapped in contradiction. "Forget the blade," Kensei said one morning. Days passed. No sword, no forms, no sparring. Takeshi felt unmoored. "I am becoming dull," he said. "No," Kensei replied. "You are becoming honest." Without the blade, Takeshi confronted how much identity he had wrapped around it. Skill had been his armor. Without it, insecurity surfaced. This discipline is called separation, Kensei said. If you cannot stand without your tools, you do not possess them. They possess you. Takeshi practiced breathing, walking, observing. The absence of steel sharpened something else. Awareness. When the blade returned, it felt lighter. The seventh discipline came suddenly and without mercy. They sparred, not formally, not ceremonially. Kensei attacked without warning while Takeshi was drawing water. Takeshi reacted late. The wooden blade struck his shoulder hard. "You were elsewhere," Kensei said. Again and again. Each strike came when Takeshi believed the moment had passed. This discipline is called continuation, Kensei said. Awareness does not end when the task ends. Takeshi learned to remain alert after finishing actions, after speaking, after resting, after winning. The old Takeshi would have relaxed too early. That Takeshi had died in Osaka. By the end of the month, Takeshi felt stripped, not weaker, clearer. Kensei watched him quietly one evening and finally spoke. 7 disciplines complete, he said. 3 remain. Takeshi bowed deeply. What are they? He asked. Kensei looked toward the mountains. They are the ones history fears the most, he said, because they cannot be controlled. If you are still walking this path, leave a comment. The final disciplines are closer than they appear. The 8th discipline did not arrive with instruction. It arrived as silence that refused to explain itself. After announcing that 3 disciplines remained, Kensei said nothing more for 2 full days. No training, no correction, no tests. They ate in quiet, walked without destination, slept early, woke before dawn. Takeshi felt unease grow in the absence of direction. His mind searched for structure the way a wounded animal searches for cover. On the 3rd morning, Takeshi finally spoke. What is the next discipline? Kensei did not answer. He handed Takeshi a pack and turned toward the deeper mountains. They walked until the shrine disappeared behind stone and pine. By midday, the air thinned. The path narrowed. Near dusk, Kensei stopped beside a small cave overlooking a steep valley. You will remain here, he said. For how long? Takeshi asked. Kensei placed a water skin on the ground. Until the 8th discipline introduces itself. Then he left. No explanation, no reassurance. Night fell quickly. The wind carried unfamiliar sounds. Takeshi sat near the cave entrance, mind racing. He reviewed every discipline so far, searching for clues. None came. Hunger whispered. Cold followed. Fear arrived last. Not fear of death, but fear of meaninglessness, of being forgotten, of being abandoned without instruction. That was when he understood. The 8th discipline was isolation. Not physical isolation alone, but removal of witness. No teacher, no approval, no correction, no audience. In his old life, every effort had been observed, every failure contextualized, every success rewarded. Here, nothing responded. Takeshi spent the night fighting the urge to leave. He imagined Kensei watching from somewhere unseen, then realized that thought itself was another attachment. No one was watching. At dawn, exhaustion weighed on him. His thoughts slowed. The valley stretched endlessly below. He felt small, unimportant, unseen. Something loosened. He realized how much of his discipline had depended on being seen as disciplined. When Kensei returned at sunset, Takeshi was still there. You did not leave, the Ronin said. No, Takeshi replied. Why? There was nowhere else to go, Takeshi said, and no one to impress. Kensei nodded. This is called self-erasure, he said. Most men cannot survive it. They need reflection to exist. The 9th discipline followed immediately. The next morning, Kensei gave Takeshi a simple task. Return to Osaka. Takeshi froze. Alone, Kensei added, and do not explain yourself to anyone. The journey back was heavier than the climb into the mountains had been. Memories sharpened with every step. The road into the city felt narrower than before. When Takeshi entered Osaka, the city moved as it always had. Merchants shouted, children ran. Life had not paused for his failure. He passed the dueling circle where his name had fallen. He felt eyes on him or imagined them. His old instincts urged him to lower his gaze, to hide. Instead, he walked openly. His father saw him first. No words were spoken, no accusations, no comfort. Takeshi bowed deeply and remained there until the silence spoke for itself. He visited his former dojo and stood outside the gate. Students passed him without recognition. His teacher glanced once, then turned away. No welcome, no rejection, just indifference. That night Takeshi slept in an inn with no name. Alone, uncelebrated, unremarked. The ninth discipline was humility without reward. Kensei had warned him of pride born from discipline. This was its cure. To bow without being acknowledged, to stand without being elevated, to exist without correction or applause. When Takeshi returned to the mountains days later, Kensei was waiting. "You returned," he said. "Yes." "Did you defend yourself?" "No." "Did you explain?" "No." Kensei nodded. "Then the ninth discipline has entered you." The 10th discipline came last, and it came gently. No tests, no deprivation, no confrontation. They trained together in silence for weeks, sparring lightly, walking slowly, sitting often. One evening as snow began to fall, Kensei spoke. "Everything you have learned can now betray you." Takeshi listened. "Discipline becomes arrogance when worn like armor," Kensei continued. "Skill becomes blindness when trusted without question." He gestured toward the falling snow. "The final discipline is called impermanence." Takeshi frowned. "You must never believe this state is permanent," Kensei said. "Clarity fades, strength weakens, attention dulls. The warrior who believes he has arrived is already leaving." Takeshi understood. The 10th discipline was continuous renewal. To return to beginner's mind again and again, to train as if untrained, to meet each moment without credit from the last. "This is why they tried to erase these disciplines," Kensei said. "They cannot be inherited. They cannot be owned. They must be lived repeatedly." That night, Kensei handed Takeshi his sword. "You are free to go," he said. "Will I see you again?" Takeshi asked. "Only if neither of us is looking," Kensei replied. They bowed. Takeshi descended the mountain alone, not as a man seeking redemption, but as one prepared to meet whatever waited without negotiation, emotion, or illusion. The 10 disciplines were no longer lessons, they were conditions, and history could erase names, scrolls, and schools, but it could not erase a man who had learned to stand in the moment before hesitation and move without leaving it. If you have followed this path to the end, leave a comment. The disciplines only live when practiced. Takeshi did not return to Osaka as the man who left it. He did not return as a victor either. He returned as something quieter and far more dangerous, to illusion. The city had not changed. The streets still smelled of smoke and river water. Merchants still argued over coins. Children still chased one another through alleys without knowing why. The world continued, indifferent to internal revolutions. That indifference no longer wounded him. He walked through the gates without armor, without banner, without explanation. This was where the disciplines stopped being training and began becoming consequences. The first test came without ceremony. A group of young men recognized him near the market road, sons of lesser families, boys who had once bowed too deeply when he passed. They now stood straighter, louder. "So the fallen heir returns," one said. Takeshi stopped walking. In the past, this moment would have triggered calculation, reputation, response, retaliation. He felt none of it rise. Emotion stirred, but it did not speak. He turned to face them fully. "What do you want?" he asked evenly. Laughter followed. One stepped closer, to see if the stories are true. Steel flashed from a half-drawn blade. Takeshi did not move, not because he was frozen, because he was complete. The young man hesitated. That hesitation revealed everything. Takeshi stepped forward once, closing distance without threat. The blade was suddenly useless. The boy's confidence collapsed under the weight of presence alone. "Go home," Takeshi said. "This is not your fight." They scattered without another word. Takeshi continued walking. This was the 8th discipline in motion. Self-erasure did not make him weak, it made him unreadable. Word spread quietly, not of triumph, of unease. People could not explain why he unsettled them. He no longer needed to. The second test came weeks later, disguised as opportunity. A minor lord sent a messenger requesting Takeshi's service. The terms were generous: restoration of honor, position within the household, public acknowledgement. Everything his former self would have reached for. Takeshi listened without interruption. When the messenger finished, Takeshi bowed politely. "No," he said. The messenger blinked. "You did not hear the full offer." "I heard enough," Takeshi replied. "Do you understand what you are refusing?" "Yes." The messenger left, confused and faintly irritated. Refusal without arrogance offended more than rejection with pride. This was the 9th discipline deepening. Humility without reward also meant restraint without recognition. Takeshi felt no relief afterward, no satisfaction, just alignment. He took work repairing nets by the river, carrying stones for a mason, sweeping temple grounds at dawn. The discipline of remaining had followed him out of the mountains. Each task received the same attention. No task borrowed importance from another. People noticed how he worked without rushing, noticed how he finished without lingering, noticed how he spoke without needing the last word. They asked fewer questions and watched more. This was how influence returned, not demanded, not announced, but unavoidable. One evening, an older swordsman approached him near the docks, scarred hands, measured breath. "You walk like someone who has already lost everything," the man said. Takeshi considered this. "I lost what could be lost," he replied. The swordsman nodded. "Then you are difficult to defeat." They sparred with wooden blades under fading light. The fight was brief, not because Takeshi overwhelmed him, but because the older man stopped. "You are not fighting me," the swordsman said. "You are occupying space I cannot enter." Takeshi bowed. This was the 10th discipline revealing itself again. Impermanence required constant renewal. He did not cling to the outcome. He did not analyze the exchange. He let it dissolve. Winter deepened. Takeshi trained alone before sunrise each day, not in pursuit of improvement, but in preservation of clarity. He returned to the beginning again and again, standing without negotiation, acting without emotion, remaining without stimulation, committing without division, enduring without complaint, separating identity from tool, continuing beyond completion, erasing the need for witness, bowing without recognition, renewing without attachment. The disciplines braided together. They were no longer steps, they were posture. The final test came quietly. One night, Takeshi was summoned to a private residence. A noble family feared an assassination attempt. They wanted protection. Quietly, discreetly. Takeshi agreed. He stood watch through the night without expectation, without imagining threat, without scanning for reward. Near dawn, movement flickered near the garden wall. Takeshi shifted, not toward the figure, but into correct distance. The intruder froze. They stood there, both aware that the next breath would decide everything. Takeshi did not attack. He waited. The intruder fled. Later, the noble demanded to know why Takeshi had not pursued or killed the man. "Because nothing required it," Takeshi answered. "You were hired to protect," the noble said sharply. "I did," Takeshi replied. "Protection is not violence. It is presence before violence becomes necessary." The noble dismissed him, unsatisfied. Takeshi left without resentment. That night, he slept deeply. Years passed. Takeshi never founded a school, never wrote a scroll, never took students formally, yet men began to seek him out, not for techniques, for stillness. He taught nothing directly. He worked alongside them, walked with them, said little. Some stayed, most left. The ones who stayed changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. History would later forget his name. It would forget Kensei's name too. But it would not forget the consequences of the disciplines passing quietly from one life into another, because what they tried to erase was never written. It lived in the moment before hesitation, and in those who learned to stand there without leaving. Takeshi grew older without announcing it. The lines on his hands deepened, his hair thinned at the temples, his movements slowed just enough to confuse those who mistook speed for danger. Age did not dull him. It refined him the way time refines stone, removing what cannot last. He lived near the river, close enough to hear it at night, far enough to let its voice remain a guide rather than a comfort. He continued to work with his hands, repairing nets, carrying lumber, tending small temple grounds no one claimed ownership over. He accepted payment when offered and refused it when it carried weight. People still came, not openly, not proudly. They came with reasons that sounded practical but were not. A failed duel, a paralyzing decision, a life that looked correct but felt hollow. Takeshi never asked their stories. He watched how they stood, how they breathed, how quickly they tried to fill silence. From that, he knew which discipline had abandoned them. One evening, a young man arrived just before dusk. Clean clothes, calloused hands, the posture of someone trained well but unfinished. "I was told you could help me," the young man said. Takeshi continued sweeping. "With what?" he asked. "I freeze," the young man said. "At the moment that matters." Takeshi nodded once. "You already know the answer," he said. The young man waited. Takeshi placed the broom aside and faced him fully. "Where do you go?" Takeshi asked. "When the moment arrives?" The young man opened his mouth, then stopped. "I think," he said finally. Takeshi returned to sweeping. The lesson was complete. The 10th discipline was the most fragile, not because it was difficult, but because it was easy to abandon. Impermanence demanded vigilance without tension, renewal without urgency, the discipline of beginning again without resentment toward forgetting. Takeshi failed it often. On certain mornings, he caught himself assuming clarity would remain simply because it had yesterday. Those mornings were dangerous. He learned to recognize them not by anxiety, but by comfort. Comfort was the signal. On such days, he returned to the first discipline deliberately. He stood without negotiation, even when there was nothing to rise for. He moved without emotion, even when no action was required. He practiced boredom as if it were sacred ground. He did not punish himself for forgetting. He began again. Years later, word reached him that Kensei had died. No details, no place. Just the knowledge that the wandering presence that had altered his life had completed its arc. Takeshi sat by the river that night and did nothing to honor the event. No ceremony, no words, no memory rehearsed. Kensei had warned him against that. Instead, Takeshi practiced. That was the only form of respect that mattered. The world changed around him. New schools rose with rigid doctrines. New lords demanded loyalty in exchange for safety. Techniques multiplied, manuals thickened. Names were carved into history by men desperate to be remembered. Takeshi remained unnamed. This was not humility. It was accuracy. Names attract followers. Followers dilute disciplines. Disciplines diluted become rituals. Rituals become theater. Theater collapses under pressure. The 10 disciplines did not survive by being taught. They survived by being embodied. One winter night, a group of soldiers arrived at his door. They carried an official seal and an order. A regional conflict had erupted. They needed men like him, men with experience, men who could decide quickly. Takeshi listened. When they finished, he asked one question. "Who will I answer to?" "Our commander," the officer replied, "and through him, the cause." Takeshi shook his head gently. "I cannot," he said. The officer bristled. "This is not a request." Takeshi met his gaze. "Then you should find someone who needs permission to act," he said. They left angry and confused. Takeshi returned to his work. This was not defiance. It was the ninth discipline alive, humility without submission, refusal without ego. On the final morning of his life, Takeshi rose before dawn, as he always had. His body felt heavier, breath slightly shorter, nothing alarming, nothing dramatic. He stepped outside and watched the river move. For the first time in many years, a thought arose uninvited. This may be the last time. He did not push it away. He did not hold it. He stood with it. Then he let it pass. Takeshi prepared tea. He drank it slowly. He swept the ground where fallen leaves had gathered overnight. He finished without checking whether it was finished well. Later that morning, he sat beneath the old tree near the river and closed his eyes. There was no final insight, no revelation, no memory review. Just breath. Just wait. Just now. When villagers found him later, he looked as though he had simply paused. They buried him without ceremony, no marker, no name. Years passed, the river kept moving. And occasionally, someone would stand at the edge of a decision and feel something unfamiliar, not fear, not confidence, but clarity without commentary. They would act, and they would never know why. That was the final discipline, not mastery, not legacy, not victory, disappearance into correctness. What they tried to erase from history was never a list of rules. It was a way of standing in the moment before hesitation and moving without leaving it.